Okay, so we're going to be talking about section 3.2 here, which is about cell transport. Again, as you're going through this, make sure you keep up with your notes, enter in the notes, take the notes that I had. You can pause it, you can take a break and come back to it later, whatever you need to do, but just make sure that you're keeping up with your notes as I go through them here. Okay, so cell transport. When we hear that word transport, usually we think of things that are being moved. Okay, whether you're moving something from point A to point B, we as humans move things all the time. Okay, we produce things here in our country and move them to another country and vice versa. Okay, that's transportation. Cells do the same thing. However, when cells are transporting things, they're usually moving something called a molecule. Okay, we've been talking about atoms and molecules. Again, cells are the smallest unit of life, so the things that they're going to transport have to be smaller than them, which are going to be our molecules that we've been talking about. Okay. So cells are going to transport these molecules. Okay, they transport them in, they transport them out. Around the outside of a cell is something known as the cell membrane. Okay, the cell membrane lets things go in and out of the cell. The cell membrane has a property called permeability. Okay, if something is permeable, it allows things to pass through it. Like, for example, a fishing net is permeable because when you put it in the water can go right through it. Permeability. Okay. Now, a fishing net, just like a cell membrane, doesn't let everything pass through it. It is what we call selectively permeable. It has selective permeability. What that means is it allows some things to go through, but keeps other things out. So a fishing net wouldn't be a very good fishing net if it didn't catch fish. So the water can pass through it, but it catches the fish. It's selectively permeable. Cell membranes work the same way, and cell membranes can selectively be permeable based on things like size of molecule, composition is what it's made of, or shape. Okay, those are things that a cell membrane can help it, or can help a cell membrane to choose what goes in and out of it. Okay, that's how it can control what's coming through. Okay, next we'll talk about a couple of different ways that cells transport things. The first thing is known as diffusion. Diffusion, this is a very important definition. Make sure you get the entire thing. Don't write half of it down. Get the whole thing down. Diffusion is the net or total movement of a molecule from an area where there are many to an area where there are fewer. Okay? Molecules like to spread out. They don't like to be stuck next to other molecules that are the same. They like to spread out. This happens randomly. They are always moving. Okay? Molecules always move, whether they're in a solid, a liquid, or a gas. They tend to spread out. They don't like to be crowded. Now, molecules in a liquid and a gas tend to diffuse very well. If you think about liquids and gases, states of matter that we have talked about, there's more space in the molecules and move more freely than in a solid. Things in a solid, molecules in a solid are pretty stuck. They're fixed in place. But in a liquid and a gas, they can move easily, so they can diffuse easily. A good example of diffusion is if you were to put food coloring into a glass of water. So let's say that all of these red dots that are here, those are all food coloring molecules. So when you first put food coloring into water, they tend to get stuck in one spot. Okay, all the food coloring is concentrated in one area, like this right here. Okay, so all of those food coloring molecules, though, they don't want to be there. They want to spread out. They want to have more space. So these molecules right here, they naturally want to go from an area where there's a lot, like here, to an area where there's few, like here. They want to spread out into that space. And over time, if we look at this over here, as time passes, the molecules will all on their own spread out evenly, like we have here on this side. Okay, these red molecules have now evenly spaced out. They're not highly concentrated in one area. That is what diffusion is. When molecules move from an area where there's a lot, like this here, to an area where there's a little, like this here. It happens over time. It doesn't take any energy for this to happen. Now, when they're all evenly spaced, this is called equilibrium. Okay, equilibrium. equilibrium, right here on our notes, is when those molecules get evenly spaced out. That word equilibrium, it actually sounds like the word equal. Okay, just like when you're doing math, an equal sign means that the stuff on one side of your equal sign, like 2 plus 2, is the same as the stuff on the other side. Okay? Equilibrium just means the molecules are evenly spaced out, like in our food coloring example. Now the thing about it is molecules don't stop moving when they're in equilibrium. Okay, they keep moving, but they just keep even spacing as they do so. Okay, so this is all based on diffusion. Diffusion, molecules move from where there's a lot to where there's a little, and eventually they will get to equilibrium like they do over here. Okay. Now one type of diffusion is known as osmosis. Osmosis is a very important form of diffusion for all cells, because osmosis is just diffusion of water across the cell membrane. Now, as water diffuses through osmosis, it usually transports other molecules with it. So because cells are made of water and surrounded by water, osmosis tends to be a very form of transport for cells. Okay, so osmosis follows the same rules as diffusion. Go from high concentration to low concentration. They still want to meet equilibrium, but this is a major form of transport for cells just because cells are made of mostly water. 70% of a cell is typically water. 70% of a human is typically water. So there's a lot of water for this to happen within. So osmosis is an important form of that. Now, if there's not a lot of water surrounding a cell, then the cell's water wants to leave it. It wants to go outside of it. And that is something that plants experience, and we actually experience this too. And the reason plants dry up is because there's more water inside the plant than outside the plant. And the water diffuses to the outside. So let's just say that we have a plant leaf. Okay. And there's a lot of water inside of the plant cells. All plant cells need to have water for photosynthesis. Outside of the plant, in the air, there's water, but there's not as much water. Okay, there's definitely more water in the plant than outside of it. And based on osmosis and diffusion, the water in the plant wants to leave the plant and go into the air, because the water wants to go from area where there's a lot in the plant to an area where there's less. So that water will actually evaporate out of the plant and go into the air. And if a plant doesn't have a constant supply of water to replenish this, then it can dry out. That's why it wilts and gets crunchy after time. Okay, transportation for cells falls into two categories. It falls either into passive transport or active transport. Okay, passive transport is just transportation within cells that doesn't use energy. Okay, does not use energy. This is, diffusion is an example of this. Osmosis is an example of this. Doesn't use energy. Okay, the next type of transport is active. Active transport uses energy. Okay, active uses energy, passive does not. An example of active transport for cells would be if a cell needs to move something against diffusion. So if it has to move something from an area where there's a little to an area where there's a lot, that's going to take energy. Okay, that is active transport. So active transport uses energy, passive does not. A good way to remember that is, let's say that you are riding your bike. So if you're riding your bike, you're transporting yourself. And if you are riding your bike down a hill, that doesn't take any energy from you. Okay, you can just coast and you can go all the way down that hill without having to pedal. It doesn't cost you any energy. But if you wanted to transport yourself up a hill, you would have to use energy. You would have to be active in order to pedal uphill. Okay, so active transport uses energy. passive transport does not. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about is a last form of transport called endo and exocytosis. Okay, sometimes cells need to move molecules that are really big, and they would have to do this in order to do that. So first of all, let's look at these prefixes. Endo means inside, and ecto or exo. Endo, exo means outside. Okay, like external. Exit means outside. Those are the same thing. So what actually happens with endo and exocytosis is the cell membrane. Cell membrane is an amazing thing. The cell membrane can actually form a bubble that can collect things or push things outside the cell. So the top one here is endo. Endo means in. So let's say that this cell needs to get all these little blue molecules into the cell. The cell membrane, which is this part here, can actually form a little pocket that the molecules can go in. And then this pocket can continue to close and pinch off until eventually it makes its own little bubble inside of the cell. Now we have a bubble containing all of these molecules that we need. Okay, this is a good little diagram to add to your notes. Find some space in there, add it in. Endocytosis is in, exocytosis is out. Now, the amazing part about this is the cell membrane, that can happen, and it doesn't put a hole in it. There's no hole in there. The molecule or the cell membrane can just pinch together. And then, if the cell needs to get rid of these little blue molecules, this bubble is made of a cell membrane. So all it has to do is push up into the cell membrane, where it can then spread apart, and the bubble just joins the cell membrane and opens up so all these blue molecules can escape. And that bubble just becomes a part of the cell membrane again. That's exocytosis, because it's sending the stuff outside of the cell. Endo is in, exo is out. Okay, so once again, these are your 3.2 notes. Follow along with them. Make sure you fill things in. You can pause it. You can go back to it. You can review it later on if you want. Just make sure you're getting your notes in there and taken care of.